Lieutenant Gale Halverson pushed his loaded Skymaster down the runway at Wiesbaden and climbed into a grey summer sky. Below him lay a defeated country. Ahead of him lay a city the Soviet Union had decided to strangle. His cargo hold was packed with flour and coal. The clock on his instrument panel told him he had minutes, not hours, to thread a narrow corridor of air, land at a single crowded field, and turn around before the next plane came in behind him. If he missed his approach, he was forbidden to circle and try again. He would fly all the way back to Wiesbaden with his cargo still aboard, because a second attempt could kill everyone stacked in the clouds above the city. It was the summer of 1948. More than 2 million people were waiting for what was in his hold. Before we go on, I want to ask you something small. Cold War Impact is a little channel covering Cold War and military history, and lately our reach has fallen off a cliff. If you enjoy carefully researched history like this, please subscribe, drop a comment, and share the video. Every click helps us reach new viewers and lets me keep making these deep dives. Now, back to Berlin. For 11 months, Joseph Stalin tried to take a city of more than 2 million people without firing a shot. He did not need to fire one. Berlin sat more than 100 miles inside the Soviet occupation zone, a western island in a communist sea. On June 24, 1948, Soviet forces cut every road, every railway, and every canal that fed the western half of the city. They shut off the electricity that eastern power stations had been supplying. Then they waited for hunger to do the rest. West Berlin had roughly 36 days of food on hand and about 45 days of coal. After that, the arithmetic of starvation would take over. The weapon that finally broke the blockade was not an army, a tank column, or a threat of nuclear retaliation. It was a fleet of cargo planes, and the idea behind them had already been proven possible years earlier on the far side of the world. To understand how transport aircraft saved a city that almost everyone in Washington expected to lose, we have to go back to what the experts believed in those first chaotic weeks, when the men running the United States Air Force said plainly that the whole thing was doomed. The doubters were not fools. They were doing honest math. No one in history had ever supplied an entire modern city by air alone. Berlin needed thousands of tons of food, coal, and fuel every single day just to stay alive. The western garrisons in the city numbered fewer than 23,000 soldiers. Around them stood something close to 1.5 million Soviet troops. A ground convoy fighting its way up the highway meant war, and America had largely demobilized after 1945. In July 1948, a senior Air Force official told the National Security Council that the air staff was firmly convinced the operation was doomed to failure. The reserves inside the city were measured in weeks. Winter was coming, and the first attempts to fly supplies in were a tangle of improvised flights, exhausted crews, and near collisions. The man who would fix all of that had not yet been handed the job, but someone in the chain of command already knew it could be done, because he had done something like it before. General Lucius Clay was the American military governor in Germany, and he refused to leave. He cabled Washington that Berlin had become a symbol of American intent, and that to abandon it was to abandon Europe. President Harry Truman agreed in 4 blunt words. "We are going to stay." But Clay was honest with the city's leaders. He told the mayor-elect, Ernst Reuter, that he was willing to try an airlift, that he could not promise it would work, and that people were going to be cold, and people were going to be hungry. Reuter chose to stand with him anyway. In September 1948, before a crowd of some 300,000 Berliners gathered at the ruined Reichstag, Reuter called out to the peoples of the world to look upon this city and to never forsake it. The civilians who had been enemies 3 years earlier were now asking the West to save them. The answer to whether that was even possible was sitting in the recent past, in the memory of an operation flown over the highest mountains on Earth. During the Second World War, after Japan severed the Burma Road, American crews kept China supplied by flying cargo over the Himalayas. They called that route the Hump. It was brutal, with savage weather, towering peaks, and a long roll of lost aircraft and dead airmen. But it proved one thing beyond argument. A sustained airlift could move enormous tonnage day after day if it was run with iron discipline. The officer who had turned the Hump from a costly gamble into a machine was named William Tunner. He had cut the accident rate and multiplied the tonnage by treating airlift as a science rather than an adventure. He had earned a blunt nickname, Willie the Whip. In the last summer of the war, his crews moved more than 5,000 tons over those mountains in a single day without one accident. That was the answer to Berlin. It had existed for years. It simply had not yet been pointed at the right city. Tunner arrived in Germany at the end of July 1948 and found chaos. The early airlift was brave and disorganized. Planes stacked up over Berlin waiting for a chance to land. Pilots made second and third attempts in foul weather. Maintenance lagged, and crews were stretched to the edge. The whole improvised effort was one bad day away from disaster, and that day came. On August 13, 1948, Tunner flew into Berlin himself, just as a wall of bad weather rolled over the city. A cloudburst dropped visibility to almost nothing. A cargo plane crashed and burned at the end of the runway. A second blew its tires braking to avoid the wreck. A third ground looped off the concrete. Above them, aircraft circled blind, stacked thousands of feet into the storm. Tunner got on the radio and ordered every plane in the stack to turn around and go home. Then he rewrote the rulebook. His new system was ruthless and simple. Every flight would fly on instruments, in all weather, on a fixed timetable. There would be no stacking and no circling. Each plane got one approach. If a pilot missed it, he flew straight back to his base in Western Germany with his full load rather than endanger everyone behind him. Aircraft would arrive in a steady stream, spaced only a few minutes apart, landing, unloading, and leaving on a precise clock. German crews on the ground learned to empty a Skymaster in minutes. Tunner also pushed out the smaller aircraft and standardized on the larger four-engine Skymasters, each one hauling around 10 tons. The airlift stopped being a scramble and became a conveyor belt. The accident rate, against every expectation, fell to less than half that of the Air Force as a whole. What grew out of that discipline was something the world had never seen. 3 airfields carried the weight: Tempelhof in the American sector, Gatow in the British sector, and a brand new field at Tegel in the French sector, built from nothing during the blockade itself. Roughly 17,000 German laborers, a great many of them women, since so few able-bodied men remained, cleared rubble and crushed brick by hand to lay Tegel's runway in about 90 days. When a Soviet-controlled radio tower stood in the way of the new approach, the French commander solved the problem by blowing it up. The British flew their own enormous share, including flying boats that set down on a lake near the city carrying salt, their hulls already built to resist corrosion. Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and Canadians flew alongside them. This was never only an American story, and the people of Berlin knew it. By the spring of 1949, the airlift was delivering more to Berlin by air than had once come in by road and rail combined. The peak arrived in a single staggering stretch of 24 hours that the crews called the Easter Parade. Between midday on April 15 and midday on April 16, 1949, they flew in 12,941 tons of coal on roughly 1,400 flights. For one full day, a loaded aircraft touched down in Berlin about once every minute. It was a message to Moscow, written in engine noise. The blockade was not working. The city would not fall. Stalin had bet that hunger would force the West out, and the bet had failed. A Western trade embargo squeezed the Eastern Bloc in return, and the propaganda disaster of starving children being fed by American and British pilots grew worse by the week. On May 12, 1949, just after midnight, the Soviets reopened the roads and the rails. The blockade was over. But here is the detail most retellings skip, and it is the reason the airlift ran for 462 days, while the blockade itself lasted only about 11 months. The flying did not stop. The Allies kept the planes running for another 4.5 months to pile up food and coal inside the city, in case Stalin changed his mind and slammed the door shut again. The airlift formally ended on September 30, 1949. Now the honest accounting. Across those 462 days, the combined airlift delivered more than 2.3 million tons of supplies into Berlin, most of it coal, on something close to 278,000 flights. The aircraft flew more than 90 million miles, nearly the distance from the Earth to the Sun. And it has to be said clearly that this was not an American triumph alone. The Royal Air Force and Commonwealth crews flew close to a quarter of the total tonnage and carried out most of the people evacuated from the city. German workers built the fields and emptied the planes. The cost was real. About 101 people died over the course of the crisis, including 31 Americans and 39 British personnel, most of them in weather-related crashes rather than enemy action. A memorial at Tempelhof carries their names to this day. The city survived. It did not prosper. Rations stayed thin, homes went largely unheated through a hard winter, and electricity flowed only a few hours a day. There was one fog-bound day in November 1948 when a single plane managed to land in the entire city. Survival, not comfort, was the victory. But out of that grim endurance came one small gesture that people still remember more clearly than any tonnage figure. The pilot from the opening of this story, Gail Halvorsen, met a cluster of children at the Tempelhof fence and handed them his only 2 sticks of gum. He promised to come back and drop more, and told them to watch for the plane that wiggled its wings. He began releasing candy on tiny handkerchief parachutes as he came in to land. Other crews joined him. American candy companies and schoolchildren sent the sweets across the ocean. By the end, the pilots had dropped around 23 tons of candy on something like 250,000 little parachutes. German children named the aircraft the Raisin Bombers. Halvorsen became known as the Candy Bomber and as Uncle Wiggly Wings. He flew quietly for decades afterward, repeated his candy drops over other suffering places in later wars, and lived to be 101 years old, dying in 2022. The airlift broke the first great confrontation of the Cold War without a battle. While the planes were still flying, the Western nations signed the treaty that created the North Atlantic Alliance in April 1949. Within months, the Western and Eastern zones hardened into 2 separate German states, and the line between them would define Europe for 40 years. A people the West had so recently fought had been turned into allies by flour, coal and chocolate falling out of the sky. The airfield at Tempelhof flew its last flights in 2008. Today its runways are a public park, one of the largest open spaces inside any city anywhere. Berliners now walk and cycle across the concrete where the Skymasters once landed every minute of every hour. When the people of the city were later given the chance to build over that ground, they voted to keep it open because of what had happened there. The blockade was meant to prove that a divided city could be squeezed until it surrendered. The airlift proved the reverse. A city could be held aloft by sheer will, by engines, and by the refusal of ordinary aircrews to quit. Stalin had asked in 1948 whether the West would let go of Berlin once holding on became too costly. 462 days of men flying flour through the clouds gave him his answer. The runways turned to parkland are still repeating it now.